The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of red sand and weathered stone that most people called desolate. Jake Morrison called it home. His workshop sat tucked between two massive rock formations, camouflaged so well that even the occasional helicopter flyover missed it completely. After 8 years of military service and too many battles in too many countries, the isolation suited him perfectly. The sandstorm had been building all afternoon, turning the sky an ominous amber color that made the horizon shimmer like a mirage. Jake had seen plenty of desert storms during his time stationed overseas, but the ones here in Arizona had a particular fury that never failed to impress him. He secured the last of his tools and headed inside his workshop, a converted shipping container that he'd modified into a surprisingly comfortable living space. The wind howled outside, rattling the reinforced walls as Jake settled down with a cold beer and yesterday's newspaper. The radio crackled with weather warnings, but he'd already battened down everything that needed securing. These storms usually lasted a few hours at most, and then the desert would return to its usual peaceful silence. That's when he saw it. Through the small window facing north, a streak of fire cut across the darkened sky. At first glance, it looked like a meteor, but Jake's trained eye caught the inconsistencies immediately. The trajectory was too controlled, the burn pattern too uniform. This wasn't space debris burning up in the atmosphere. This was something with engines, something trying to land or crash. The object disappeared behind a ridge about 3 miles out, followed seconds later by a distant boom that shook dust from the workshop ceiling. Jake sat frozen for a moment, weighing his options. The smart thing would be to stay put, let whatever had crashed stay crashed, and pretend he'd never seen anything. His instincts, honed by years of combat experience, screamed that this was the kind of situation that ended badly for civilians who got involved. But curiosity had always been his weakness. Jake pulled on his jacket and goggles, then fired up his modified dirt bike. The machine had been his pet project for the last 2 years. Enhanced suspension, oversized tires, and an engine tuned for maximum torque over sand and rock. If something had crashed out there, and if there were survivors, they wouldn't last long in this storm. The ride through the sandstorm was brutal. Even with his goggles, Jake could barely see 20 feet ahead as the wind whipped sand against his face like tiny bullets. The bike's headlight created a cone of swirling amber dust that disoriented more than it helped. He navigated by memory and instinct, following the rough direction where he'd seen the object fall. 20 minutes later, he crested a small rise and found it. The crash site was like nothing Jake had ever seen. A crater roughly 30 feet across had been carved into the desert floor. The sand around its edges turned to glass by intense heat. At the center lay what could only be described as a spacecraft, though it looked nothing like the NASA shuttles or military aircraft Jake was familiar with. The hull was a seamless silver-blue metal that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, even as it cooled. Strange symbols covered its surface, glowing with a soft inner light that pulsed rhythmically. Jake killed his engine and approached cautiously, every military instinct on high alert. The craft was small, maybe 20 feet long, clearly designed for a single occupant. Steam rose from its surface, where the driving sand struck the superheated metal. As he circled the crater's rim, he spotted a section of the hull that had cracked open, revealing glimpses of the interior. That's when he saw her. The figure slumped. Inside the cockpit was humanoid, but clearly not human. Her skin had a subtle blue-silver tint that caught the light from the craft's glowing symbols, and what looked like natural luminescent markings traced delicate patterns along her arms and face. She was unconscious, maybe worse, with dark fluid that could only be blood seeping from a gash on her forehead. Jake hesitated at the crater's edge. Everything about this situation screamed, above your pay grade. This was first contact, alien technology, government cover-up territory. Getting involved would change his life forever, and probably not in a good way. The smart play was to call the authorities and let them handle it. But she was injured. Dying, maybe? Damn it, Jake muttered, then scrambled down into the crater. Up close, the alien woman was even more striking. She was tall and gracefully built, wearing some kind of form-fitting uniform made from a material that looked like metallic fabric. Her features were elegantly angular in a way that was clearly non-human, but undeniably beautiful. The luminescent markings on her skin pulsed weakly, in sync with her breathing. Jake checked for a pulse and found one, though it was rapid and thready. She was alive, but in bad shape. The head wound was the most obvious injury, but he could see other cuts and burns where debris had struck her during the crash. She needed medical attention fast. "Okay, let's get you out of there," Jake said, more to himself than to his unconscious patient. He carefully extracted her from the wreckage, surprised by how light she felt despite her height. Her body was limp but still warm, and he could feel the faint rhythm of her alien heartbeat as he lifted her. The storm was intensifying, and Jake knew he had to move fast. He managed to get her onto his bike, positioning her unconscious form in front of him so he could support her during the ride back. The trip to his workshop was a nightmare of wind and sand, made worse by his need to drive carefully with his injured passenger. Once inside, Jake laid her on his couch and began assessing her injuries with the thoroughness his military medical training had taught him. The head wound was superficial, but bleeding freely. More concerning were the burns on her arms and what looked like internal injuries from the impact. He cleaned and bandaged what he could with his first aid supplies, though he had no idea if human medicine would work on alien physiology. As he worked, Jake found himself studying her face. Even unconscious and injured, there was something regal about her features, an air of nobility that suggested she was someone important wherever she came from. The luminescent markings on her skin continued their slow pulse, like a heartbeat made visible. Hours passed. The storm gradually died down outside, but Jake barely noticed. He sat beside the couch, monitoring her breathing and occasionally checking her pulse. Around midnight, her eyes finally fluttered open. They were the most extraordinary eyes Jake had ever seen, a deep violet color with flecks of silver that seemed to move like liquid mercury. For a moment they were unfocused, lost in pain and confusion. Then they sharpened and fixed on him with startling intensity. The alien woman tensed immediately, her body coiling as if to spring into action. But the movement sent a visible wave of pain through her, and she collapsed back onto the couch with a soft gasp. Her eyes never left Jake's face, wary and calculating. "Easy," Jake said quietly, raising his hands to show they were empty. "You're hurt. I'm not going to harm you." She studied him for a long moment, those remarkable eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that made English sound like music. "Human," she said, making it sound like both a question and a statement. Jake nodded. "Yeah, you crashed in the desert. I brought you here." He gestured to the bandages on her arms. "You were pretty banged up." Her hand moved instinctively to the bandage on her forehead, wincing at the tender spot. Her gaze swept the workshop, taking in the tools, the simple furniture, the obvious signs of a solitary life. When her eyes returned to Jake, some of the wariness had been replaced by puzzlement. "You saved me," she said slowly, as if testing the concept. "Why?" The question caught Jake off guard. "You were hurt. I couldn't just leave you there to die." Something shifted in her expression, surprise, maybe even wonder. She struggled to sit up despite Jake's protests, moving with obvious pain but determination. Once upright, she looked at him directly, and Jake felt the full weight of her attention like a physical force. "I am Nix," she said formally. And I am in your debt, Jake Morrison. And you don't owe me anything? He paused, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd found her. What happened out there? Why did you crash? The light in Nyx's luminescent markings dimmed noticeably, and her expression grew distant. I was cast out, exiled, left to die among the stars. Her voice carried a weight of pain that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. My people decided I was no longer worthy of life. Jake felt a familiar anger stir in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to leave the military, the rage at powerful people who treated others as expendable. Hell of a way for family to act, he said grimly. Nyx's violet eyes snapped back to his, startled by his understanding. For a moment, vulnerability flickered across her features before she could hide it again. You do not know what I have done, what I am guilty of. Doesn't matter, Jake said firmly. Nobody deserves to be thrown away like garbage. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain and shared understanding. Outside, the desert had returned to its peaceful quiet, but inside the workshop, two damaged souls had found each other in the aftermath of a crash that would change both their lives forever. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Jake realized there was no going back. He'd made his choice the moment he'd climbed down into that crater. Whatever came next, whatever consequences followed from harboring an alien exile, he'd face them. Because sometimes, doing the right thing was the only choice that mattered. Dawn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson as Jake prepared a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and coffee. He'd offered Nyx the bed in his small sleeping alcove, but she'd insisted on remaining on the couch, claiming she needed to stay alert. Her alien physiology seemed to be healing remarkably fast. The luminescent markings on her skin pulsed with renewed vigor, and the wounds he'd bandaged the night before were already showing signs of rapid recovery. She sat upright now, her violet eyes tracking his every movement with the wariness of someone accustomed to danger. Despite her obvious strength returning, there was something fragile about her posture, a carefully controlled tension that spoke of recent trauma. You don't have to watch me like I'm going to attack, Jake said gently, setting a plate of eggs in front of her. I know you could probably take me even injured. Nyx studied the food suspiciously before taking a tentative bite. Her eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. It is ... pleasant. We do not prepare sustenance this way on Asteria. Asteria? That's your homeworld? The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her luminescent markings flickered, and she set down the fork with trembling fingers. It was. I have no home now. Jake settled into the chair across from her, nursing his coffee. Want to talk about it? Sometimes it helps. For a long moment, Nyx said nothing. Her gaze drifted to the small window overlooking the desert, and Jake could see the internal battle playing out across her features. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was Princess Nyx Stellarum, third in line to the Asterian throne. My father, Emperor Valdris, rules an empire that spans 17 star systems. Her hands clenched into fists on the table. He is a conqueror, a destroyer of worlds. And I tried to stop him. Jake remained silent, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever fragile trust was building between them. Asterian Empire has existed for 3 millennia, Nyx continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. We were once explorers, scientists, artists. We sought knowledge and beauty among the stars. But power corrupts, and over the centuries, we became something else. Something terrible. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window like a caged predator. The morning light caught the subtle blue tint of her skin, making the luminescent markings shimmer like living jewelry. My father's latest campaign targeted the Meridian Cluster, 7 peaceful worlds inhabited by species that had never known war. They were farmers, philosophers, healers. Their only crime was existing in space that my father coveted. Her voice cracked with emotion. The first world fell in 3 days. Billions dead. Their cities turned to ash. Jake felt his own anger rising. He'd seen enough of war to know the cost of unchecked power, but the scale Nix described was beyond anything in human experience. I tried to reason with him, Nix continued, her reflection ghost-like in the window glass. I begged him to show mercy, to find another way. He laughed and called me soft, weak, unsuited for rule. She turned back to Jake, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks, tears that glowed faintly with the same luminescence as her markings. So I acted. I gathered those in the military who still remembered what we once were, officers who were sickened by the slaughter. We called ourselves the Stellar Covenant, sworn to protect the innocent, regardless of species or system. Led a rebellion, Jake said quietly. It wasn't a question. Nix nodded, sinking back into her chair as if the weight of memory had exhausted her. For 2 years, we fought a shadow war. We evacuated civilians before the fleets arrived, sabotaged supply lines, fed intelligence to resistance movements. We saved millions of lives. But you were caught, betrayed. The word came out like a curse. My own brother, Prince Zephyr, turned us in. He always believed our father's vision of Asterian supremacy was right. He saw my compassion as treason against our bloodline. Jake reached across the table, covering her clenched fist with his hand. The gesture surprised them both. Her skin was warm despite its alien appearance, and he felt a subtle tingling where their flesh touched. The trials were a sham, Nix whispered, not pulling away from his touch. My followers were executed publicly, made examples of what happened to those who defied imperial will. But I was family. Even my father couldn't bring himself to order my death directly, so he exiled you instead. Left you to die slowly rather than quickly. Traditional punishment for royal treason is being cast into the void, launched into space in a minimal survival craft with just enough fuel to reach the nearest uninhabited system. If you survive the journey, you live out your days alone on whatever barren world you find. If not ... double quotes. She shrugged with forced casualness. That's barbaric, Jake said, his grip tightening on her hand. Nix looked down at their joined hands with wonder, as if she'd never seen such a thing before. Among my people, physical comfort is rare. We are taught from birth that strength comes from isolation, that relying on others makes you weak. I have never. No one has ever ... What? Held your hand? Jake asked gently. She nodded, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. In the royal court, even family members rarely touch. Emotional connection is seen as vulnerability. I grew up surrounded by people, but utterly alone. Jake's heart ached for her. His own childhood hadn't been perfect, but he'd known love, friendship, human warmth. The idea of growing up in such cold isolation was almost unimaginable. You're not alone now, he said simply. The words hung between them like a bridge. Nix stared at him with those remarkable violet eyes, searching for deception and finding none. Slowly, tentatively, she turned her hand palm up beneath his, their fingers interlacing. You barely know me, she whispered. I could be lying about everything. I could be dangerous to you. Are you lying? No. Are you going to hurt me? Never. The word came out fierce and immediate, surprising them both with its intensity. Then that's all I need to know, Jake smiled. And for the first time since awakening, Nix smiled back. It transformed her face, making her look younger and impossibly beautiful. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined across the simple table while the desert sun climbed higher in the sky. Eventually, Nix spoke again, her voice thoughtful. My survival craft was damaged before I even reached your solar system. The navigation systems failed, life support was failing. I thought I would die in the cold dark between stars. Perhaps that would have been justice for my failures. Your failures? Jake's voice sharpened. You tried to save innocent people. How is that failure? Because I wasn't strong enough to succeed. The genocide continues even now. While I sit here in safety, worlds are burning. Jake squeezed her hand. You did what you could with what you had. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. The alternative is giving up, and that helps no one. Nix studied his face intently. You speak as one who knows such burdens. What wars have you fought, Jake Morrison? It was Jake's turn to feel exposed. He'd become skilled at deflecting questions about his military service, but something about Nix's openness demanded honesty. In return, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, places where the powerful sent young soldiers to die for reasons that never made sense. On the ground level, he met her gaze steadily. I lost friends, good people who believed they were making the world better, who died for causes that seemed to change with every briefing. Is that why you live alone in this wasteland? I needed distance from it all. The politics, the lies, the endless cycle of violence justified by noble words. Out here, things are simple, clean. He gestured to the desert beyond the windows. No hidden agendas, no collateral damage. Just survival. Until I crashed into your simple life and brought all my complications with me. Nix said with bitter humor. Hey, Jake's voice was firm. I chose to pull you out of that wreckage. I chose to bring you here and patch you up. Nobody forced my hand. But why? You could have called your authorities. Let them handle the alien crash. It would have been safer for you. Jake considered the question seriously. Because I've been where you are. Maybe not exiled to another planet, but cast out by people who were supposed to have my back. When I left the military, I felt like I'd lost everything that mattered. My purpose, my identity, my place in the world. I know what it's like to be alone and hurting with nowhere to go. Nix's luminescent markings pulsed brighter, and Jake was learning to read that as a sign of strong emotion. You saved me not just from death, but from despair. Do you understand what that means to someone who has lost everything? It means you're alive to fight another day if you choose to, or to find peace if that's what you need instead. And what if I choose to stay here with you? The question caught Jake completely off guard. He'd been thinking tactically, how to keep her hidden, how to help her heal, maybe eventually how to help her find passage off-world. The possibility that she might want to remain hadn't occurred to him. Your people will come looking, he said carefully. Even if you're exiled, someone's going to want to confirm you're dead. They'll track the crash site eventually. Then we'll face that when it happens. But Jake, I have nowhere else to go. No people who'd accept me. No cause left to serve. Here, with you, I feel something I've never felt before. What's that? Hope. The word was soft but certain. For the first time in my life, I'm with someone who values compassion over conquest, who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. Perhaps this exile was not a punishment, but a gift. The chance to discover what life could be like without the weight of empire and duty. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising desert heat. Looking at Nix, really looking at her, he saw not just an alien princess or a fugitive from a galactic war, but a woman who had sacrificed everything for her principles and found herself cast adrift in an unfamiliar world. If you stay, it won't be easy, he warned. This isn't exactly luxury living, and if your people do come hunting, things could get dangerous fast. Nix's smile returned, and this time it held steel as well as warmth. Jake Morrison, I led a rebellion against the most powerful empire in the galaxy. I think I can handle life in the desert with a former human soldier. In that case, Jake said, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. "Welcome to your new life, Princess Nix of Arizona." She laughed, a sound like silver bells in the wind, and the last of the walls between them crumbled. As the sun reached its zenith over the endless desert, two exiles from different worlds began to build something new together, a future neither had dared to imagine. The desert dawn broke with unusual beauty, painting the sky in watercolor washes of pink and gold. It had been a week since Nix's crash, and the princess had recovered with remarkable speed. Her luminescent markings now pulsed with vibrant health, and the graceful way she moved spoke of returning strength. But Jake had learned to read the restless energy in her violet eyes. She was a warrior without a war, a leader without followers, and the enforced inactivity was wearing on her spirit. "We need to prepare," Nix said over breakfast, her tone matter of fact. "My people will come? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will come. And when they do, we must be ready." Jake nodded, having reached the same conclusion. The crash site was still out there, and while the sandstorm had covered most of the wreckage, sophisticated alien sensors would eventually detect the anomalous metal signatures. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Standard protocol for confirming an exile's death is 30 planetary rotations. We have perhaps 2 weeks before they send a reconnaissance probe. Maybe another week after that before a recovery team arrives. Nix's expression was grim. "They'll expect to find only my remains and scrap metal. Instead, they'll find evidence that I survived, that someone helped me, and that someone will become a target. Yes," the single word carried a weight of regret and determination. "I will not let you suffer for my sake. Jake, if you wish me to leave, stop." Jake reached across the small table, covering her hand with his. The gesture had become natural over the past days, a simple comfort they both craved. "We're in this together. But you're right about needing to prepare. Can you teach me about Asterian tactics? Weapons? Anything that might give us an edge?" Something shifted in Nix's expression, surprise melting into gratitude and something deeper. "You would learn alien warfare?" "For me?" "For us," Jake corrected. "This is our fight now." What followed was an intensive education, unlike anything in Jake's military experience. Nix proved to be a patient but demanding teacher, sharing knowledge that no human had ever possessed. She explained Asterian combat doctrine, their preference for precise strikes over brute force, their reliance on energy weapons and personal shields. "Your human military tactics rely heavily on projectile weapons and explosive devices," Nix observed as they examined Jake's rifle collection. "Asterians will be prepared for such crude methods, but they will underestimate human ingenuity and adaptability." "Crude?" Jake raised an eyebrow, chambering a round in his favorite hunting rifle. "This crude weapon can punch through body armor at 800 yards. Mim." They set up targets among the rock formations behind Jake's workshop, old cans and bottles at varying distances. Jake demonstrated the rifle's capabilities, and Nix watched with keen interest as bullet after bullet found its mark with mechanical precision. "Impressive accuracy," she admitted. "But observe, from somewhere in her salvaged belongings, Nix produced what looked like a crystalline wand about the length of her forearm. With a fluid motion, she aimed at a target nearly twice as far as Jake's farthest shot. A beam of coherent light lanced out, and the metal can simply vanish in a puff of vapor. "Plasma projector," she explained. "Standard Asterian sidearm. No projectile to dodge, instantaneous travel time, and enough focused energy to burn through most forms of protection." Jake let out a low whistle. "Can you teach me to use it?" "The weapon is biometrically locked to my genetic signature, but I can teach you to fight against them." Nix's expression grew serious. "And you can teach me your human methods. Combined, we might have a chance." Their training sessions became a dance of learning and discovery. Jake taught Nix the fundamentals of marksmanship, how to account for wind and distance, the importance of cover and concealment. In return, she showed him Asterian close-quarters combat, flowing movements that seemed almost like martial arts, designed to work with their naturally enhanced speed and agility. "Your people move differently than humans," Jake observed after a particularly intense sparring session. They were both breathing hard, sweat glistening on their skin despite the early morning coolness. "More fluid, like water, and humans are like stone," Nyx replied, not unkindly. "Solid, enduring, harder to break than you appear." She touched a spot on Jake's shoulder where she'd landed what should have been a disabling strike, only to have him power through and counterattack. "I hit you with enough force to drop most Asterians, but you barely flinched. Pain is temporary. Losing is forever." Jake grinned, quoting one of his old drill sergeants. "Besides, I had good motivation to stay standing." "What motivation?" Instead of answering with words, Jake stepped closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek. The luminescent markings on her face pulsed brighter at his touch, and her violet eyes widened with surprise and something else, hope, maybe, or longing. "This," he said simply. "Us, whatever this is becoming." Nyx leaned into his touch, her own hand covering his. "Among my people, warriors do not. We are taught that emotional attachment weakens combat effectiveness. That caring makes you vulnerable. Maybe that's why you lost," Jake said gently. "Hard to fight for something if you don't care about it. I cared about justice. About protecting the innocent. That's different. That's duty. I'm talking about this." He gestured between them, the space that seemed to crackle with unspoken possibility. Personal stakes. Something worth fighting for instead of just against. Nyx was quiet for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known, Jake Morrison. On Asteria, showing such emotion would be seen as weakness. Here, with you, it feels like the first strength I have ever possessed." The space between them seemed to shrink without either moving. Jake could see his own reflection in her alien eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. Time suspended itself in that perfect moment of anticipation. "Nyx," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "Yes," she breathed. And then there was no more distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, an exploration of unknown territory. But as Nyx's arms wound around his neck and Jake pulled her closer, it deepened into something fierce and desperate. She tasted like starlight and promises, and when they finally broke apart, both were trembling. "I have never ... Nyx began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "Neither have I not like this." Jake rested his forehead against hers, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms, despite their obvious differences. "Not with someone who matters this much." They stood like that as the sun climbed higher, holding each other in the growing warmth of the desert morning. Around them, the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. A vast canvas of solitude that had once felt like exile, but now felt like sanctuary. "What happens when they come?" Nyx asked eventually, her voice soft against his chest. "We fight. We survive. We protect what we've found here. And after? If we win?" Jake pulled back to look at her, seeing hope and fear warring in her expression. "Then we keep building this. Whatever this is, wherever it leads. Together." Nyx smiled, the expression transforming her face with radiant joy. "I never believed in fairy tales, even as a child. Royal princesses in my culture do not get happy endings. But perhaps human fairy tales are different. The best ones are," Jake assured her, sealing the promise with another kiss. They spent the rest of the day working side by side, fortifying the workshop and preparing defensive positions among the surrounding rocks. But there was a new quality to their partnership now, touches that lingered longer than necessary. Shared glances full of unspoken communication, a harmony that spoke of two people becoming one. That evening, they sat together under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Jake had ever seen. The desert night was cool and peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of nocturnal life beginning to stir. "Tell me about your stars," Jake said, his arm around Nick's as she leaned against his shoulder. "Which ones would you like to know about?" "The ones that matter to you. Your favorites." NYX pointed to a constellation Jake didn't recognize, her finger tracing patterns in the darkness. "There, that cluster that looks like a flowering vine? That is the Garden of Memory, where my people believe the spirits of the honored dead tend to celestial gardens for eternity. My grandmother used to tell me stories about it when I was very young before I learned that princesses were not supposed to believe in such things." "What kind of stories?" "That every flower in the garden represents a moment of true love, genuine compassion, or pure sacrifice. That the garden grows more beautiful with each act of grace in the physical universe." Her voice grew wistful. "She said that when our lives ended, if we had lived with love and purpose, we would be welcome there to tend our own flowers." Jake squeezed her closer. "Sounds like a good place to end up. Do you think what we have here might grow a flower in that garden someday?" The question was asked so quietly, so vulnerably, that Jake felt his heart clench with protective tenderness. Here was a woman who had given up everything, throne, family, world, for her principles, and she was asking if their impossible love story might be worthy of her grandmother's fairy tales. "Princess," he said, tilting her chin up so he could see her luminescent markings glowing softly in the starlight. "I think we're going to grow a whole damn garden." Her laughter was like music, bright and joyful and full of infinite possibility. And as she kissed him again under the alien stars, Jake realized that his life had been transformed, not by the crash of a spacecraft, but by the collision of two hearts that had been searching for home without. Knowing it, whatever came next, hunters from the stars, battles in the desert, an uncertain future on a hostile world, they would face it together. And that made all the difference. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, witnessing the birth of something new and precious in the vastness of the desert night. Two exiles had found their kingdom in each other, and no empire in the galaxy could take that away.